Just a couple of days ago here on the channel, I was talking about how Marvel Comics almost couldn't give away the X-Men writing job. Couldn't give away Uncanny X-Men. Couldn't find anybody that wanted to take the gig. And typically, people would be fighting to be the writer or artist on X-Men, and they would want to stay there long term because, in theory, or at least in the past, that would mean potentially decent royalties. Maybe not enough to live on for the rest of your life, but a check coming in years after you worked on it because it would continue to be in print. They would be using your illustrations for, t-shirt covers and lunchboxes and all that kind of stuff, and you would get some more moolah about that. Marvel Comics, notoriously thrifty, or they like to screw people over, depending on how you look at it, have definitely driven a lot of creators away. We know lots of people have stepped away from Marvel Comics, and even creators that are still there. Like, let's take a Mark Bagley. You think about Mark Bagley, his work on Spider-Man, he's probably illustrated more Spider-Man comic books than anyone in the history of comic books. The dude has done a ton of Spider-Man work, and when you look at t-shirts and you look at lunchboxes and any other type of licensed product out there featuring a Spider-Man image, you see Mark Bagley's Spider-Man art a lot of times. And you would think, with the amount of stuff that you see his art on, he's probably a millionaire. Time and time and time over, he probably gets at least like a half a cent on everything sold with one of his images on it. And I do not believe that's the case. And that's one of the reasons a lot of really good creators no longer want to be associated with Marvel Comics anymore, because it's just not worth it. Even if you make them a ton of money, they will never reciprocate. They will basically just try to continuously screw you over. This is all coming out of something that happened with Jen Bartel. If you remember her, she was doing a lot of the She-Hulk covers there for a while. And she's certainly done a lot of work for hire at Marvel Comics. And they're using a lot of her images in a game called Marvel Snap, which I guess is like an e-card game. The characters have powers and all that kind of stuff. And she's doing a lot of the illustrations and a lot of the more rare cards, the more coveted ones that maybe you have to pay for and stuff like that. Not only feature her art, they feature her name as a reason that you would want to get that. And somebody reached out to her, and she kind of spilled the beans and put Marvel Comics on blast on how they're treating her in that situation. Player Chase Pitzer posted saying, "So this new Jen Bartel variant is absolutely incredible. Paired with the perfect crackle, I'd say we have a grail split. Need more of her fantastic work in the game, please." To which Jen Bartel replied, "Wish I actually got paid for these, LOL," which launched a number of replies. Jen Bartel will have been paid for the original comic book creation of the art, but not for its subsequent license use elsewhere. She added, "It's actually perfectly legal because we have to sign over all rights to any licensed art we make for mega corporations who own these characters, but it's definitely not ethical to shaft artists like this. Some companies like Mondo, Rip, paid us for usage even when they didn't have to." Later adding, "Imagine if the artists who actually made the art they make millions of dollars off of even got to see a fraction of a percentage of that. A cover I might have been paid $800 for will go on to make them 100 times that amount, and they will never send me an additional dime." And hence, we have a lot of very talented artists and writers, creators out there that would be huge assets to Marvel Comics, to working on Spider-Man, working on X-Men, Iron Man, Captain America, and all these type of properties that almost refuse to do any business with them anymore because they know they will only be taken advantage of. And a lot of people will say, well, she signed the contract, and there's certainly some truth to that. She did sign the contract, and what they are doing is perfectly legal within the confines of that, because apparently when you're an independent contractor in the comic book world, you sign over all rights to everything you ever do in perpetuity, which is absolutely ridiculous. That's not really how commercial art works in a lot of spaces. We'll kind of get to that here in a little bit. So I do appreciate Jen going out there and explaining, while I don't like what's going on here, I do understand it, and it is perfectly legal. But from an ethical standpoint, if you're going to go out there and use my art in other applications, you might want to actually throw a little bit of money my way, or otherwise, maybe I'll get upset. Maybe I won't want to work with you anymore. Maybe even despite being the 2-time cover artist of the year or whatever, I think that she won with the Eisners, I'll just stop doing covers on She-Hulk or whatever, which was certainly making the comic book that much more desirable because, quite frankly, the story by Rainbow Rowell and some of the other writers that they put on there before that, like Mariko Tamaki, aren't very good. And really the cover art might be the only actual reason to buy it. And people were asking, is like that why you step away from She-Hulk? And she actually provided a lot more information, which I think is interesting. And I've got a couple of other stories to kind of tack on to the end of this. Bartel replied, the very few times I asked for even a small pay raise over a 4-year period, the answer was no. What would you do if your employer never gave you even a modest salary bump in nearly half a decade? Later adding, just FYI, I signed the contract all artists are made to sign before I had ever done a single cover for a major publisher way back in 2015 and was never allowed to renegotiate the terms in any capacity. This is the standard. Awards and recognition did not give me negotiating power. Trust me, regardless of how much or how little I got paid, I'm still very grateful for the opportunities I've had in my career, but I'm done towing this line publicly and pretending like I didn't have to accept an unfair level of exploitation just like every other working artist. Talking about her negotiating power or lack thereof after working for Marvel for several years, signing an initial contract in 2015, and a lot of people would say, rightfully so, but it's the contract that she signed, and if it doesn't allow for renegotiation later on, she should have thought about that in the first place. And completely true, but when you take somebody that's very young in their career, take advantage of them, they are going to have a very bad taste in their mouth after an experience like that. The best example I can think of is when Todd McFarlane had talked about why he left Marvel and why he didn't want to work on Spider-Man anymore, ended up leaving, going over to Image Comics, and a lot of it had to do with seeing his art in places besides the comic books, but never ever actually receiving a check for it. Noticing that his work was out there, being marketed and being used for other commercial gains, whether it be on t-shirts or whatever, and then them never even acknowledging it to him, and just acting like, hey, that's our art. And it caused him to leave, and he's never come back. And what's one of the things that Marvel Comics could do at this time that would just sell like gangbusters that everyone would definitely want to see? Todd McFarlane on Spider-Man. They pissed him off to such a degree, we will likely never see it again because they just kind of wanted to screw him over. This also brings up another story, and I have to be a little bit more, careful about this one because I did hear about it, but I can't like give the exact names or maybe who was doing it. But what I was told is that a high-level Marvel person was going to a cover artist that was a very respected cover artist and done a lot of really good work and certainly made Marvel Comics quite a bit of money over the years. And when it came time for their renegotiation, they actually wanted to lower his rate. And you're like, well, why would they want to lower his rate if they were making money off of him? The work was just as good. He was actually going out there and, delivering an audience to Marvel Comics that they might not have had otherwise. And this is what I told. I don't have the exact specific verbiage, but apparently this person from Marvel throughout the last year or two had been noting all the times that they'd had conversations, and maybe he'd gone on vacation, or maybe he bought his wife a car, or maybe she bought her husband a new video game system, and all these kind of excess expenditures, I guess, in the minds of the Marvel Comics person. And they decided, well, you clearly don't need as much money as we're paying you. We're going to pay you less now because you're clearly doing great with the page rate that you have now, and you don't even need that. Even though this person had completely earned it over the years with their work and the amount of people and interest they actually brought to Marvel Comics, which just kind of demonstrates to you what a shitty company Marvel is and kind of what a shitty industry, comic books are. Although I've never heard of DC doing anything like that. I've never heard of DC doing anything like that, but that was a story about Marvel, and it makes you think, when you hear stories like this, it isn't worth it. I can see why you stepped away. There are other places out there to ply your trade. You don't have to work in comic books. You can go and dabble in indie comics if you want. You can go and do video games. You can go out there and do concept art. There's a billion things you can do with your artistic ability. Why would you waste it on a company that clearly doesn't respect you, doesn't appreciate you, has no interest in ever giving you a raise, even though their page rates for art have been stagnant for, 30 or 40 years at this point? You're probably never going to get a raise because they keep driving customers off. And at some point, it doesn't become worth it anymore, not only to artists, but certainly the writers. And that's where Marvel Comics find themselves. And you can say, well, she signed the contract. That's what she gets. And you are correct. But Marvel Comics treated their talent the way they did, and that's what they get. They get people that don't want to work with them anymore. They can't find a fucking writer to go write an X-Men comic book, one of the most prestigious, opportunities in the entire comic book industry, and they couldn't fucking give it away. They could only get Gail Simone. And we're talking, that was like the 10th or 11th call that they made, looking for a big name person to put on the title because they don't treat people very well. Also, Jen does point out, working in other areas of commercial art, this isn't the standard. In contract terms, it's about usage rights and licensing fees on different product formats. Before I worked in comics, I was a product and packaging designer who handled licensed art. Some art we could use only on ceramics like plates and bowls, or other textiles like pillows. If we wanted to use a piece of art that we only had a textile license for on a new ceramic collection, we had to go back to the artist and negotiate new terms. There were also limits on usage timelines, usually 1, 2, and 5-year licenses. In physical goods, this is standard. What's especially frustrating about current contracts is that many new media digital use cases, such as popular mobile trading card games, is that the apps didn't even exist when a lot of us signed our original contracts, and they were never allowed to be revisited. Basically, technology that didn't exist at the time, that does exist now, that's being used to proliferate the art that's been created, was never included in the original contract, but now they're just incorporating in there, and you're not allowed to go back and say, hey, if you want to use it this way or that way, I would like a piece of the pie. Or maybe if you want to use it in perpetuity, you should have to give me a one-time fee or something, because essentially the artist, or a lot of artists within comic books themselves, have no rights to their own work. If you work at a company like Marvel Comics, which, I kind of understand that you do want the access and the rights to those images in perpetuity. They are characters that you own and all those things. And yes, in 30 years, you might want to release that in a trade and be able to, bring that to the market, if there's a demand for it. And you don't want to have to go out there and renegotiate with 5 different artists every time you want to do a trade. I completely understand that type of mentality and that thinking. And using that for a comic book when it comes to trades and royalties and all that stuff, I completely understand. But once you start using it outside of comic books, you need a better way. There needs to be a better system. The artists need to be compensated better. Writers need to be compensated better. In fact, there's somebody out there that has a plan on how to do this. His name's Mark Miller. And every time he comes up with this plan and he puts it out there, he gets ridiculed by the comic book industry, and nobody wants to support him because, I don't know, he hangs around with the wrong people. He's not the right kind of person they would like to support, even though they have to acknowledge every single time with what he comes up with, the way that he would pay and the way that the royalties would work would benefit essentially every creator in comic books. But people need to understand you have to look to visionaries like Mark Miller who have solutions out there. This isn't a problem that can't be addressed, and I don't believe you can actually unionize because you're all independent contractors, but there is the way to bring your force to bear and actually enforce change in the industry. But you can't support Mark Miller and his plan because he's the bad guy. If you don't remember this and how simple it was and how much sense it really made, we had Rich Johnston and Heidi McDonald and all those people going out there fighting at him, despite admitting the entire time that he was right. This is absolutely insane, and this is why this industry will never get better. Look at this plan and look what they had to say about the man.